Hello, everyone. Welcome to Canaan STL Podcast, brought to you by Canaan Baptist Church, where we exist to connect you to what matters most, to God, to people, and to purpose. This is Pastor Daniel, and today I'm joined with Pastor Martin Winslow, and it's been a couple of weeks since we've done a podcast like this. We've rebroadcasted some things we were doing on our panel discussions, but it was kind of good to be back in the saddle, isn't it, Martin?
Yeah, it's good. Glad to be here, Daniel.
All right. Well, today we are kind of having probably our final conversation, at least for now, about eschatology. We've been in this series for some time. And gosh, Martin, we could go on for years on this topic. There's just, there's just so much there. But we're, we've had a good run at this, and I've enjoyed it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I've enjoyed talking about it. I've learned a lot and had a greater appreciation for, especially the views I don't hold, like the post-mill and on-mill view. So I've learned a lot about that. So I appreciate, your diligence in that. And,
thank you too. I did not. I was probably the weakest on the historical pre-mill approach, and so I understand it very well now. After you've
good fun.
Told me your position.
So today we're talking about probably maybe one of the most important issues in the whole conversation. And maybe we should have done this earlier. I don't know, but we're having it now, and it's kind of one of the final installments of this piece. We'll go on to different topics here in the weeks to come, but today we're looking at the dating of the book of Revelation.
Yep.
So why is this an important issue?
Well, it's a critical issue in so many ways, but mainly, it could change the entire trajectory of your hermeneutic as it relates to the book of Revelation. If John wrote Revelation pre-70 AD, there's a large consensus that would believe then that the events that are detailed in the book of Revelation are really talking about the destruction of the temple under Vespasian and his father Titus the emperor in 70. And so, if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each one of them record Jesus' Olivet Discourse, which starts with the question about, the disciples are amazed at the size of the temple. And then comes this threefold question by the disciples about the destruction of the temple, when's the end of the age, and when's your coming. The post-mill and the ah-mill position believe that those are redundant questions, kind of like the same way of asking three ways of asking the same thing.
Right.
And so if that's true, that Jesus then begins to answer that in the Olivet Discourse is only missing from the Gospel of John. Many would believe then and look at Revelation as John's Olivet, which happened in 70 in their mind. So it's not this future account, but it's an account where most of it, if not almost, 90% of it took place in Jerusalem in 70. So it really changes the trajectory of how you understand.
So with the early dating, Dan, just to be clear, several things. One, so you're saying that John writes the book of Revelation as Jesus' Olivet Discourse, but from John's vantage point, is that still in the future? The 70 AD, so John writes it before 70 AD. So from John's vantage point, when he writes Revelation, it's still in the future from him, from his perspective.
That's correct.
But it would just be an immediate future.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, this is why this is so critical when we bring this out, is if the early writing is true, meaning that the Apostle John writes the book of Revelation prior to 70 AD.
Yeah.
That's a strong argument for the post-ah-mill, which is a partial preterist view, right?
Exactly.
And it makes the pre-mill view more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult, right? If the writing of the book of Revelation is 95, 96 AD, after the destruction of the temple,
right,
that pretty much is a nail in the coffin for the on post-mill position.
Right. Then you'd have to be our post-mill, but you'd have to be looking back at the past of what, and not a future proposition. That was
John's writing about the past as if it's a future.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, it makes it really difficult.
Yeah. Right. So this is a big issue.
It is.
Big issue. Now, I know we talked about this before. When I was in seminary, most books I've read on the topic prior to the last few years has assumed a later dating of Revelation. Right. But there is some, it's not new, but it seems to be gaining some steam about the different arguments, et cetera, for an earlier dating. So let's just go through some of this. So what are some of the external evidences outside of the Bible, if you will, and then we'll look at internal evidences. So external, outside the Bible, internal, inside.
Okay.
What are some external evidences of an earlier writing?
Yeah, I think some external evidences would be that, when you look at the things that Jesus mentioned in the Olivet Discourse, and he gets real specific about things that are going to happen in the end. He talks about that there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. He talks about there are going to be earthquakes and all kinds of things that are going to happen.
Yeah, famines, pestilences, all that, right?
And if you look at early Roman history, a lot of those things can be explained within the post and Amil viewpoint. Matthew records an earthquake at the crucifixion. Matthew records another earthquake at the resurrection. Acts chapter 16 records an earthquake while Paul is in prison. There's all kinds of crazy stuff going on in the first century. If you look in 61 AD, an earthquake destroys, a third of the cities that Paul had planted churches in Laodicea. In 62 AD, 16,000 people were killed in an earthquake that wrecked Pompeii and Herculaneum. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. And you remember Pompeii, it's super famous, right, from Mount Vesuvius exploding.
Yep.
Like there was a lot of stuff going on. So when you look at the early church and you say, okay, all this stuff in Revelation is symbolism of what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24 and in Luke's gospel and in Mark. There looks like there were some pestilences and some earthquakes and lots of those different things already happening in the first century, leading up to God's destruction of the Jewish temple. And there was finality in that as well. So if you look at the external evidence, you look at Solomon's temple, right? So if you look at kind of like the big picture of what God is doing in history, God he gives his covenant to the children of Israel in Exodus chapter 20. They can't keep the law, and so he gives them a way to maintain the covenant. Covenantal maintenance comes through the tabernacle. Once they get into the Holy Land, there's this temple of Solomon. Because of their idolatry and those kind of things, right, that Solomon's temple is destroyed. Zerubbabel's temple is erected. That's destroyed, right? Then it's rebuilt again, and then under Antiochus Epiphanes, the Syrian general, it's not destroyed, but it's desecrated. That's when Hanukkah comes. And then you've got Herod's temple during Jesus' period. But after Jesus' period, when he predicts in Matthew chapter 24 that all these things must take place within this generation, this is how the post and are reading that, right? That within a generation this is going to happen, which is 40 years. Then you see once and for all the temple finally abolished, that system, because of the cross, right? Veil of the temple's torn in two at Jesus' resurrection or crucifixion. They believe that there's a finality in the person of Christ. Everything was in Jesus. And so they look at Revelation, all those things talking about that express moment. And that ended, the Judaistic period ended in 70. So
sure.
That's just external evidence. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I don't think the pre-mill would disagree with anything you said there, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's external evidence.
Right.
Some external evidence arguments for the later dating would be, primarily in the church fathers, the early writings of the church, what did they understand? So, the strongest one's probably Irenaeus. Yeah. Irenaeus was discipled, I believe, by Polycarp, who was discipled by John. So there's kind of a relational connection there. And Irenaeus, he writes this. He writes this around 180 AD. He says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision," meaning John. "For that was seen not very long time since, but almost in their day towards the end of the Domitian's reign." So again, the latter dating would be under the reign of Domitian, right? And so here Irenaeus directly refers to John's receiving the apocalyptic vision, which of course is the book of Revelation, as being during the Domitian reign. And there's other early church writers that have written on this. You have Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Eusebius. All of these supported Irenaeus' statement of the Domitian date, which means the 95-96 AD. And, if you look at the dating of when these views were espoused, Irenaeus 180, another church father, Victorinus at 300, Eusebius 300, Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, 400, Sulpicius Severus, I don't know how to say his first name, AD 400. So there's just a lot of early church fathers that all attributed the dating of Revelation to John's under Domitian's reign, right? So that's an external. Another external evidence is there's no historical record of Nero, what's the word I'm looking for? Exiling anyone to the island of Patmos or any island, right? There's a lot of records of Domitian doing that. So the exiling of anyone would be, outside the Bible, the external evidence would be more likely to happen under Domitian than it would have Nero. So that's some more external evidence. Another external evidence, this kind of goes into internal, but you mentioned the earthquake in Laodicea in 61 AD. Well, Laodicea is one of the books one of the churches in Revelation that Jesus addresses as being lukewarm, very casual in their faith. Talking about the hot and the cold water. So it seemed like all the systems are in place, which early dating would have put that was just 3 or 4 years after the earthquake. It's hard to imagine a city's rebuilt and doing fine and settled and a church could be lukewarm that quickly. The Laodicean issue is much later. And I want to say that it might even be the Laodicean church. No, it's the Church of Smyrna. The Church of Smyrna did not even exist in that early in the 60s AD, which is that's going to be an internal. We'll wait on that then. So, there's some good external evidence, early church leaders all pointing back to a Domitian date. Whereas, there's some research that shows that the early dating was argued as early as 200 AD. Most shows about 400 to 500 AD is when the first appearance of that argument. Hey, this was a Nero era writing instead of. So anyway, but there's research there kind of on both sides, but the early church fathers, in my book, that's a strong argument externally for a later dating. Go to internal evidence. What internal evidence?
Yeah, I think the strongest internal evidence is probably the temple that's mentioned in Revelation 11. When you read it at face value, it seems to be like in the post and awe interpretation that the temple is still standing during the time of John. We talked about this on Sunday nights. I'm not sure we talked about it here, but we've talked about it. Revelation 11:1 and 2 says, "And there was given me a reed like a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under their foot for 42 months. So John's told to go and to measure the temple. And then there's also a mention of 42 months where the Gentiles are going to trample the holy city. Now, these events sound like in real time, John, go right now, go measure the temple like it is existing. We know after 70, the temple wasn't existing. And then there's the mention as well of the Gentiles treading it under their feet for 42 months, which if you look from the persecution of Nero in 64 with the burning of Rome until his death in 68, it's a time period of 42 months.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably one of the best arguments is, it seems like, at least at face value, that the temple exists. John's told to go and measure it, and then there's this persecution that's going to happen.
Yeah, so just some simple pushback on that. So where was John when he received this vision?
Patmos.
He's on Patmos. He's not in Jerusalem, so he can't just go measure something that's hundreds of miles away, right? Also, it's a vision, right? He sees this vision, and it's within that vision. This is the pre-mill view. It's within that vision he's called to go measure this temple, the temple in the vision. Very similar to Ezekiel. Ezekiel prophesied in the Old Testament time right after the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. Yet he has the vision of the temple as well. And it's not the literal temple in Jerusalem at that moment. It's a future temple that he's seeing. So it's not without precedent that this temple is a vision temple. It's not the literal temple in Jerusalem, right, to go measure. Because he couldn't go measure it. He's hundreds of miles away, exiled on the island of Patmos. And it's debated whether he ever gets off of Patmos or not. Some say he did, some say he didn't. But anyway, that's good. What other internal evidence?
Yeah, well, just to push back on the pushback, like
I love it.
Yeah. So the thing about it is, though, it's like in John, the way John says it, it's a future event. The holy city shall they tread under their feet for 42 months. Almost like it's this event that's coming. So be ready for it, John.
Yeah.
So
again, pre-built. Say amen, amen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's the strongest. I mean, if you also look, though, within the book of Revelation, you're also going to see the beasts that are mentioned. And if you look at those beasts and you count from history, so if you start with Julius Caesar and you go to Caesar Augustus, and then you go to Tiberius, and then you go to Caligula, and then you go to Nero, what you do is you look at exactly the number mentioned of this multi-headed, dragon that's coming from Rome. And it just comes out to the exact number, followed by, at his death, 4 quick intermediary groups or people, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and there's one other that escapes my mind, before the coming of Vespasian, who sends his son Titus to destroy Jerusalem. And so if you just look at it and you look at this internal evidence, as well as we have spent some time on 666, which in gematria spells Caesar Nero. Those things seem to me to be really good internal evidences that it made sense to the first century writers and authors and also hearers. And so I don't think it was this thing that was this unmistakable person or this mistakable person in the you guys, this isn't really for you. It's for a future event, and it really doesn't apply to you somehow. I think it applied to the first century readers, and I don't think it can't mean what it never meant. And I think it meant something to the first century readers. One of the best arguments, I think, as well on the 666, which spells Caesar Nero in the Jewish language, there's a number system. Every letter is given a number, and when you spell that out in Hebrew, it spells Caesar Nero. There is early Greek manuscripts that actually have the number 616 in them, and in the Greek language, 616 spells Caesar Nero. So in Judaism, it's 666, but in Greek it's 616. And so I think people were pointing to the beast as being Nero. Now, we could get into the weeds on a lot of other things, but I think just in general, as I read it, there's a lot of first century prophecy that's going on there. Okay. And fulfilled in 70.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
What do you think about that? Like, just kind of at face, when you think about those same kind of things, I know.
I'd be interested in the sequencing of the kings of Rome, Caesars, whatever, if from John's vantage point, that is future, right? A lot of those kings were already in the past.
Right. He says one is, right? Yeah. And one will be.
Yeah. But there's more than just one. And like 6 or 7, and there a kind of a sequencing to it.
Let me get the verse here. You keep going.
Well, I was going to. So internal evidence for a latter dating is really, so number one, if it was an early dating, like before 70 AD, and John's writing this, then John's ministry in Ephesus would have overlapped with Paul's ministry in Ephesus, because Paul writes to Timothy, 1 Timothy. Timothy was leader in Ephesus. And so if the early date's true, John would have been leading in Ephesus at the same time as Paul and Timothy. So you have John there, Paul there, Timothy there, all at the same time. And so why would Paul leave Timothy there in charge, right, if John's already there? And so also at the end of 2 Timothy, Paul mentions 17 co-workers by name, but doesn't mention John. Another argument is the church at Smyrna, right? So in Revelation, Smyrna is listed as one of the 7 churches Jesus addresses. But according to Polycarp, who was, again, a disciple of John, he states that the church at Smyrna, they weren't believers during the time of Paul. So if that was a true statement, which Polycarp said, just that next generation, how could John write to a church that didn't exist yet? while Acts 19:10 says all who lived in Asia heard the word of the Lord, that doesn't mean a substantial church existed yet. They've been gospelized, but maybe not formed into the gospel community yet. Paul never mentions a church existing in Smyrna in any of his letters. Of course, that's an argument of silence, but it would take later time to develop that. And the third argument is Paul writes of the church in Laodicea. I mentioned that already with the 61, you said 61 AD earthquake. Doesn't seem like a city could be rebuilt with aqueducts to bring both cold and hot water down that becomes lukewarm. All those systems in place that quickly after the earthquake to facilitate an early writing. And then the fifth is just John's banishment to Patmos. I think I mentioned it. There's no record of Nero banishing anyone. It was he executed Peter, he executed Paul, he executed Andrew. There was no banishing. So again, you have Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is a very suspect historical document. Yeah. Right. But
I like it.
I do too. It attributes it to Domitian. Yeah. So I guess it's back to an external evidence, but he attributes it to Domitian, but he also says, that, well, he tried to execute John, but couldn't. So,
right.
So that's just some high level 35,000 foot view issues with the seven particular churches mentioned. And if it's an early dating, another argument of silence, but if it's an early dating, why didn't Jesus address the church in Jerusalem? Why were they not mentioned? Why was there no churches in the land of Israel mentioned? They were all in Asia. Why would that be? Right? An argument of silence, but there's just a great void of those logical, circumstantial situations that take place that seems to me to indicate it's a later writing.
Yeah. Here's that passage in Revelation chapter 17, verse 10. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The seven heads are seven mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also seven kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does, he must remain for a little while. So 5 have fallen.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, Caligula, Claudius. 5 have fallen. One is Nero, right? The other is yet to come. And when he does, he must only remain for a little while, which is the year of 4 Caesars. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and one I'm forgetting off the top of my head. So it does work out on the time frame. So if you're a first century Christian and you're reading that and you see this about there's 7 kings, 5 have fallen, one is and one's to come, what are you thinking?
Well, it could be 7 kings or 7 kingdoms. You could go either way there. Right. So, in the premill view, those kingdoms are the beast empires. It's those nations that have intentionally persecuted God's people. So Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, skip Persia, Rome. Then the 7th will be a future one that is, then will not be, and the 8th and final will be the future Babylon, right? The beast empire. Mm-hmm. So that's the premill view of that text. It refers to the kingdom, not just a person. And it's not all one kingdom. It's 7 different kingdoms.
Well, that's possible, I guess. But if you look at verse 9 that comes before verse 10 there, it says, this calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings. The 7 mountains, the 7-hilled... Mm-hmm. 7 hills of Rome. City is Rome. Mm-hmm. So that's an argument for it being kings rather than kingdoms.
And that's where the comparison is that whatever this future Babylon's going to be is going to be like Rome.
Sure.
Rome's a city, it's an empire, it's a religious system. Right? It's all 3 referred to as Rome. And then you use this term Babylon, so Babylon's going to be the same. It's going to be a religious system, a city, or an empire, right? So there's a lot of connections there. What about, though, the arguments of the cities of the churches of Asia in Revelation?
I know.
What's the preterist response?
I know there's some internal evidences. I'm not actually ready or prepared to argue those, but I do know that there's some pretty good arguments that do some pushback on some of that. For instance, one thing that you mentioned, though, is, like you said, it's an argument from silence is, from 61 to 63 or whatever, what happened with the Church of Laodicea, right? Mm-hmm. You had this earthquake. Well, I mean, the Roman army built 53,000 miles of road in the ancient world. They're some of the best builders in the world. So to get a city like that back online, I don't know. I think it's doable. You know what I'm saying? And I think some of those things, I could argue right back, but I get what you're saying. It's kind of like, how do you want to look at the evidence, and what to you personally seems to be more of an argument for pro or con? I look at those things and I see those kings, and to me, it's like a straightforward reading. From 61 to 63 on, rebuilding of a city, to me, it seems like, well, that's doable, but I understand your argument too. It's just in your mind, it's like, well, I don't know, that's really pushing it. And that adds to your view. You know what I'm saying? So so I get it. It's kind of like, we just have to weigh the evidence, and we may just kind of like, we're a hung jury, Yeah. It's like, we can't come to a conclusion.
Yeah. And gosh, there's so much out there.
Yeah.
That's on both sides.
Yeah.
That shows good evidence, and I think it's just up to us as individuals just to dig into it.
Yeah.
But this is a big issue.
It is. It is.
I mean, again, kind of like I said earlier, if I walked out of here today thinking that the early dating is is what's true, right? Yeah, it would really push me toward the partial preterist view. Doesn't necessarily totally cancel a premill view, because you still do the near and far concepts, but it definitely pushes you way down the road toward a partial preterist, amill, post-mill view. Whereas, like we said earlier, also, if you take the later dating, that pretty much blows up the partial preterist view. That Revelation then is therefore entirely future, except for the seven churches piece. So yeah, it's an important issue. There's a lot of good articles, websites, books. Like, probably the best book on the early dating would be R.C. Sproul's book, I would guess. The Last Days According to Jesus.
It's good. There's another book by a guy named Kenneth Gentry, but I should have took a look at it before the podcast, but it's called Before Jerusalem Fell. And his argument is that John wrote it before Jerusalem fell.
And I'm not sure I'm sure there is, because everything's under the sun, right? But I don't know off the top of my head of a book that's specifically dedicated to demonstrating a later date.
Yeah, I don't either. Not off the top of my head. It's assumed. It's definitely assumed by most scholars.
Right?
Yeah.
I guess there hasn't been the burden of proof, so to speak, until recent days. So, so somebody out there needs to write that.
Yeah, I know one of the arguments against you talked about Irenaeus, who had his disciple Polycarp, and, there was some mention there. I do know that there's some arguments out there that he got some numbers and some dates wrong. When you look at external evidence, I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the things is, I think in Irenaeus, he says at one point, Jesus was like 50 when he was crucified. We know that's not true, because he was born in 4 BC. So, But again, you got to kind of put that in the hopper over which, okay, that's con.
There's always be pushback,
but there's all these pros.
There's pushback to the pushback.
Yeah, and there's pushback to the pushback. Right. So it's just where you land. But I think probably, and I think you would agree to this, the best way, right? The best way to come to a conclusion on this is to be honest exegetically, like to look at the text itself, to read the scriptures and say, God, teach me, help me to understand this in light of this whole theological frame, this whole theology that you gave me. Don't let me just read it on its own and not consider the Gospels, but help me to see it for what it is, and give me your mind.
Yeah, that's right.
And help.
And it's really hard to do. It's hard to go in and say, okay, Lord, help me to set my pre-existing bias aside.
Right.
And be truly open-minded about this. That's really hard.
It is.
Especially when it comes to something like eschatology, because we kind of go into this from our viewpoint, which is, that's normal.
Yeah.
That's not a fault or a flaw. No. It's just what we do, right?
Exactly.
It's just like we look at political issues from an already existing political viewpoint.
Right.
We look at scripture from a certain theological viewpoint. So it's not right or wrong, but in order to tackle something like this, you have to be able to try to do that.
Right.
You say, okay, I know I'm premill, I know I'm a futurist, or I know I'm a partial preterist, but let me just lay that aside. And if I was just looking at this, clueless, what's the most easy, probable explanation for all this.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's been interesting on these talks we've had, I don't know how many weeks we've been at this, but during these talks, I have almost convinced myself again of amillennialism. And then I've come back and be like, no, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And seen some compatibility in the other views that I hadn't seen before, even in my current position.
Right.
And that's helped inform it.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
It's been good.
Yeah, absolutely. And another hard thing about the dating piece is you can't prove history.
Right.
History is it's impossible to prove anything that's happened in the past, because scientifically to prove something has to be measurable, observable, and repeatable.
Yeah.
We can't go back and do any of that, right? And so kind of the rule of thumb is when looking at history, you look at evidence, and then based on the evidence, you ask the question, what is the most probable explanation?
Right.
Not possible. Anything's possible, right?
Yeah, right.
But what is the most probable?
Yeah.
So you look at those, you kind of put that together. And so you go into let's look at all this evidence, lay it all out. And then what do I come to as the most probable explanation, right? So you do that with the resurrection, right? We can't prove the resurrection,
right?
Because we can't go back and measure the time it took Jesus to come out of the tomb. We can't go back and observe him walk out of the tomb.
Right.
And it will be repeated one day for us, but for Jesus, it was a one and done. He is so scientifically, we can't prove the resurrection. So what do? We look at evidence. Look at all the evidence. You look at the witnesses, the testimonies, internal evidence of Scripture, external evidence of Scripture, like writings of historians like Tacitus, Eusebius. You point back to this historical event. You look at how do you explain that this movement of Christianity just exploded all over the Roman Empire?
Exactly.
So much so that from the time Jesus was crucified until Nero burned Rome, there's enough Christians all the way up, thousands of miles away in Rome, to blame the city's burning on. How do you explain that rapid advancement, right?
Exactly.
So you look at all the evidence and ask the question, what's the most probable explanation? It's by far, okay, it really happened.
Right.
It's true. Well, same thing is here. If we pursue looking at the dating issue, it's got to be the same approach.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities, but it all together, what is the most probable explanation of what is true? And that's where you got to hang your hat.
Yep.
But it's fun.
It is. It's been great.
Yep.
Thanks for
thank you.
Being willing to do it. It's been fantastic. I've learned a ton.
Yep. Well, I look forward to tackling our next few topics, which it's going to be a surprise next week. Really, because we haven't decided. We've got a few in the coffer that we want to address.
I was looking at you when you said surprise. I was like, am I supposed to know? It's a surprise to both of us.
Yeah, it's going to be a surprise to all of us. But anyway, it's going to be good. So we got some exciting ones coming up. Theological, practical, current events type stuff. So it's going to be good. Well, hey, thanks for listening in. If you have any questions, comments, just go ahead and shoot them our way at info@canaanstl.org. And we'll talk to you next time on Canaan STL Podcast.